Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. Nicaragua's veteran autocratic leader, Daniel Ortega, has been locking up political dissidents for years. And now he has a new tactic: mass deportation and withdrawal of citizenship from those who dare to criticize him and his family. My guest today is Félix Maradiaga, who was recently taken from his Nicaraguan prison cell and flown to America. The good news is he's been reunited with his family after years apart. The bad news is Ortega is trying to eliminate all opposition. So has resistance become impossible in Nicaragua? Félix Maradiaga in Miami. Welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be back here.
Well, it is great to have you back on Hard Talk, not least because you have just emerged from more than 600 days in a Nicaraguan prison. Was it a surprise when you were told that you were to be released?
The release was a surprise, Stephen. We were under terrible, inhumane prison conditions, and one of the most complicated parts was the complete isolation. We were not allowed phone calls for 611 days. I had no access to lawyers. Even our trial took place inside the prison. So we were not able to really know what was going on outside.
Is it true that you lost, I think, nearly 60 pounds, that is what, 20 or more kilos, in the course of your imprisonment?
Indeed. By the way, I've gained 30 pounds of that since November, and that brings me to my next point. By November, prison conditions changed substantially in comparison to the first phase, to the first year of our imprisonment, and we had a sense that something positive was going outside. During the first time of our arrest, the first year, we were in complete isolation. Food was very bad. And not only that, but we were not allowed to have any contact with our family members for as long as 40 to 90 days. Meetings with our relatives took place under police surveillance. But towards the end of last year, families were allowed to bring food to many of us. And that was a small signal, a hopeful one, that something positive could happen outside. But that time, as it was my case and the case of the other presidential candidates arrested and the other activists, we already had been condemned to many years in prison. In my case, 13 years sentence.
This is a difficult question in a way, but I am very mindful that one political prisoner who was held in the same wave of detentions as you, Hugo Torres, he did not survive. And I know the conditions you've described, you say, were awful. I believe for a time you were actually held in complete darkness. I just wonder how close to the limits of your endurance, your ability to survive, did you come?
It was a test of the human spirit in every sense. Hugo Torres was my friend. Despite the fact that he and I had substantial ideological differences, he was truly a democratic person. He fought during the Sandinista revolution. And during my years at the Ministry of Defense, we focused on reconciliation. And Hugo Torres died in mysterious ways, almost in front of me. When I was in solitary confinement during the first few months of my arrest, he was the only person I could actually see. And I saw how a strong man, little by little, was becoming weaker and weaker. He asked for medical attention, which was always denied. So the death of Hugo Torres is only one more example of the police state and the inhumane situation in which Ortega keeps most Nicaraguans. Entire Nicaragua is under arrest. Even Nicaraguans who think that can walk freely are deprived of their freedom. Nicaragua has become a huge prison.
Well, you were, as you've already acknowledged, you were actually formally sentenced to 13 years for, quote, conspiracy to undermine national integrity. But the fact is, you were arrested and imprisoned when you had declared that you were going to run for the presidency of Nicaragua back in 2021. Do you think that was the reason that Ortega wanted you out of action?
I think it was the reason. In my case, I've devoted my entire life to promote human rights in Nicaragua, first as a civil servant in charge of demobilization and the reintegration of former combatants, and later as an academic. But not only in my personal case as someone who opposed Ortega, those who oppose Ortega from the platform of journalism, those who are student activists, human rights activists, everyone who wants to be outspoken against the Ortega regime is persecuted and put into prison.
You had a choice to make when they told you could be released, because I believe they made it plain to you that release would involve immediate removal from Nicaragua. You would be put on a plane and taken to the United States. Now, as I understand it, some fellow prisoners of yours, other political prisoners, they chose not to do that deal. They refused, and they are in prison to this day, including high-profile prisoners like the Catholic Bishop Rolando Alvarez. He wanted to stay. Why did you decide that you were prepared to leave your home country?
Well, it's the first time I want to share this publicly. I had made that promise to my wife. Keep in mind that I already had an arrest warrant back in 2018. I went back to Nicaragua and was placed in house arrest prior to this particular arrest before. So I had promised to my wife that if I had faced this scenario, I was going to do my best to be free and be with my family. I had not seen my daughter for 3 years at the time. And the decision of Bishop Alvarez, which I faced before, is extremely brave. Bishop Rolando Alvarez is in prison because he was brave enough to stay back there and face Ortega through his nonviolence resistance and through the force of his faith.
But, I mean, it's easy for me to say this, sitting in a comfortable studio in London, but your decision, in a sense, do you feel that it, in a way, represented a victory for Ortega? He wanted you out of Nicaragua. He's now stripped you of your citizenship, so you can't go back. In a sense, by agreeing to the deal, which everybody watching this and listening will understand, but by agreeing to it, you've given Ortega what he wanted.
It's anything but a victory. It's very hard for him to justify in front of his supporters that we are criminals who fought against Nicaraguan sovereignty, and suddenly we're placed in a plane and sent to the United States and received as heroes, not only by the Nicaraguan community, but by the international community as well. And on top of that, giving our voices back to continue explaining what the situation in Nicaragua is. Ortega has to work very hard to explain that decision. I think that dictators release political prisoners not because they want to, but because they don't have any other option.
Let's just talk about what it meant to you personally, getting off that plane in Washington. I believe that your wife and your daughter, who's obviously very young, I think she's 9 years old, they were able to be reunited very quickly with you when you got off the plane. After more than 600 days in very difficult captivity, what was that like?
It's the most magical experience in my life. It was very hard to go back in 2019 when I knew that I was going to face trial and that I was going to be persecuted. So I always played that painful image in my mind, the day that I went back to Nicaragua back in 2019. And I knew that at some point I was going to be reunited with my daughter, with my wife, Alejandra, with my mother. But I frankly was not clear how many years ahead was going to be until I could hug them again and talk to them. It was magical. And I knew that my wife, Berta Valle, had been a relentless advocate for my freedom, together with the wife of another political prisoner. So I knew that my wife was fighting very, very hard, traveling the world to put enough pressure for us to be released. It was very, very magical.
You use a very interesting phrase. You said just a few days ago, in your first flush of freedom, you said, "I have been doing a heart audit." a heart audit to make sure that we come out of this horrendous place without emotional scars that would hinder the work that is still to be done. What do you mean by this audit of the heart?
Stephen, this is very personal for me. My father was a political prisoner. He was tortured under the Somoza dictatorship. Later, during my years as a young kid, I was a refugee in the United States for another situation, the Civil War of Nicaragua. And what I've noticed is that Nicaragua has a cycle of violence. Those who fight a dictatorship, at the end, they become what they hate. So we need to break that cycle of violence. And the only way to do that is by not hating those who persecute us, who put us into prison, and rather try to work out of reconciliation and out of solidarity of all Nicaraguans. It's very, very hard because the natural human tendency when you go through so much suffering is to basically hate those who put you in that situation, who made our family suffer. In my case, I made it very clear, I hold no hatred for any Nicaraguans. We want a democracy, even for Sandinistas. We can have a country for all of us in tolerance and in peace. And that's my faith, and that's my commitment to every Nicaraguan.
How can you not hate Daniel Ortega after this?
I think that nobody can build anything productive out of hatred. I strongly disagree with him in many, many areas, and I think he's a war criminal. I think he's a dictator. But I think that personal, direct hatred doesn't allow you to think in a very strategic way as a leader. And when you are trying to represent a broad coalition, when you're trying to represent a country, you cannot let your own personal resentments to get in the way of what's strategic. And in this case, a strategy means human rights. A strategy means human dignity. A strategy means mobilizing the international community for the reconstruction of a country that is completely kidnapped by the Ortega family.
Right. Well, we focused on your extraordinary personal story. Let's get a little bit strategic in this interview. Is there not a case for saying that Ortega, by doing this mass release of 222 prisoners, including yourself, he is hoping to get something back from the United States, who had been pressuring him to do just this, to release the prisoners? And Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, said this in a statement after your freedom. He said, the release of these individuals by the government of Nicaragua marks, quote, a constructive step towards addressing human rights abuses in the country. It opens the door to further dialogue between the U.S. and Nicaragua. That'll be music to Ortega's ears, won't it?
Oh, absolutely. But I think that going back to being a strategic, he is not, because he erased with one hand what he wrote with the other. I think that if he had not done things such as keeping Bishop Alvarez in prison and other 35 political prisoners, stripping us from our nationality and so on, I think that probably dialogue would be on the table from the perspective of the American governments and other governments. But I can be certain that we are not going to see any relaxation of the international pressure, precisely because Ortega has proved that he is focused on his on building his dynasty and on keeping the police state. So Ortega, if anything, is radicalizing, and that needs to be very clear.
And yet, if one looks at the international reaction to what Ortega has done, as you say, with the stripping of the citizenship, not just of the 222 prisoners released, but also another 90 activists who have since had their citizenship taken away from them. The Latin American leaderships in countries like Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil have been very quiet, haven't they? Have you noticed?
I have noticed that, but I have a different perspective. I think that for the very first time in decades, and I can say that myself as someone who's testified in front of the UN Security Council, in Geneva at the Human Rights Council as well, and traveled Latin America 5 to 7 years ago, it was very hard to mobilize certain people who had previous sympathies to the Sandinista revolution. That is not the case anymore. It is very clear that the Ortega of today has nothing to do with the Sandinistas of the 1980s, and he's being abandoned, isolated even by former friends. I think that is very powerful that we have many of the progressive leaders of Latin America speaking against him.
I understand you want the world to see Ortega in a particular way, Mr. Maradiaga, and you've said, you know, he's part of a global ecosystem of dictatorships working very closely with Russia, with China, and dictatorial regimes such as Cuba and Venezuela. But isn't the truth that Latin American leaders at the moment appear to have no appetite to put more pressure on Nicaragua? And if one looks at the wider perspective of the Biden administration, not only did Blinken talk about, you know, the possibility of opening the door to dialogue with Managua, but also the United States appears to be backing off direct confrontation with the Maduro regime in Venezuela. There seems to be an air of pragmatism rather than confrontation coming from Washington.
I would agree with you on that regard. We need much more international pressure. And in the case of Nicaragua, it has been very hard. Nicaragua doesn't have petroleum, oil. We don't have geopolitical importance to the level of Venezuela, for example. So I've been working very hard in explaining, even before that, in books, for example, that we published back in 2009, explaining Ortega's dangerous relationship with Iran, with Russia, with China. And I think that little by little that is being taken into account, not at the speed that we wanted, but we hope that this is a new phase of international diplomacy against the Ortega regime that would allow us to isolate completely that police state.
But to be clear, when you talk about isolation, I always wonder how far you really think you want the international community to go. Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, second only to Haiti. Your people in Nicaragua are so poor and so desperate, hundreds of thousands of them every year are trying to escape the country, whether to Costa Rica or through Guatemala and Mexico to try to reach the United States. Are you proposing that in that context you want to see tougher economic sanctions put on Ortega and his regime?
Toughest economic sanctions, targeted sanctions against the Ortega inner circle, because people in Nicaragua is poor precisely because there's a corrupt regime. I understand, and I've also been very careful in not speaking about economic actions or sanctions that will hurt the poor. I think that that's very important to emphasize.
But they do hurt the poor, Mr. Maradiaga. Look at the reality. I mean, the United States last year, in response to what they saw as egregious abuses by the Ortega regime, put new sanctions on the gold mining industry in Nicaragua. But if you look at the Nicaraguan economy, the gold mining sector is one of the few relative success stories which actually employs thousands of Nicaraguans. So, of course, those sorts of sanctions ultimately will hit your fellow citizens.
I think that there are types of sanctions, and I personally disagree with your understanding of the gold industry. It's something that I've studied and researched, and I can tell you that most of that money goes into Ortega's inner circle. But that will be a technical discussion on gold, which I don't want me to go into that. But indeed, there are many ways, which is very hard to explain in this public platform, to tackle Ortega's wallet, to tackle Ortega's inner circle. And those are the things that we're working on.
I hate to say it because it's painful for you, but you're stateless right now. I mean, the Nicaraguan parliament is going to rubber stamp Ortega's demand that you be stripped of your citizenship and your passport. So I just wonder how you go forward from here. You could walk away. You could probably claim asylum in the United States. Frankly, you could make a new life for yourself. Are you tempted to do that?
Well, I need time to heal, and that's what I meant when I said that I need an audit of the heart. I need time for my family. I don't have, and I don't claim to have, the strategic answers for what's to come. But one thing I know, I will remain committed to a new Nicaragua and to a way in which all Nicaraguans can have a humane and decent future. Now, regarding my nationality, I think that the Ortega regime doesn't have any authority, even though they reformed the constitution and they stripped us from our nationality, but that is an illegitimate government. So that action, in terms of my understanding of it, doesn't have any implications. I am a Nicaraguan, and I will remain a Nicaraguan today and always.
If you feel that strongly, then I guess you're very actively reflecting on how best to politically mobilize and organize to challenge Ortega's grip on power. I see that in 2021, the opposition talked about finding a unity, a candidate who could challenge Ortega and rally all of the opposition. But you failed. I mean, you, I think, represented the Blue and White Party. There was a Citizens Alliance. There were a bunch of other political parties. You couldn't find a way to coalesce, to unite, to send a signal to the Nicaraguan people that here is one candidate all of you can get around to get rid of Ortega. Why did you fail?
I respectfully disagree, Stephen. Remember that in February of 2021, the five main candidates at the time signed an agreement to go into a primary elections, and we were about to go into the primary elections to select a single candidate. We were all put into prison. We had until August the 2nd to reach a single candidate, and that was the reason why Ortega put us all into prison. And you're right in one point: we didn't move fast enough. That's a political mistake. But we were on the right track to choose a unified political candidate. Having said that, I think that we can work strongly and in a more candid way to pursue unified political opposition. And we're working very hard in not to commit the mistakes of the past.
Just before we end, I want to again get personal with you, and it's a reflection on your extraordinary personal story, because you first entered the United States as an unaccompanied minor, aged 12. You trekked across Guatemala and Mexico and got into Texas, and then ended up getting an education in Florida as an immigrant. As I said earlier, hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans right now are trying to make a new life in Costa Rica or trying to get to the United States. For you, with your special perspective as a political leader who actually was a child migrant, do you believe that Nicaraguans who leave the country today are doing the right thing for themselves and their families?
I think they are, because no one can call a country their own if they cannot pursue their dreams, if they cannot be free, if they cannot pursue an education for their children. And they're doing it because they don't have any other options. However, I don't think that the world can solve our own problems. We Nicaraguans have to focus on trying to build a new country, and there are some people that take great personal challenges. I'm only one of many examples. Many other Nicaraguan has gone through terrible things to face Ortega. But those who do not have a chance, they only have exile as a chance, and that's why we need to care, because we can only solve this humanitarian crisis, not only a political one, but a humanitarian crisis, by involving the international community in finding a solution.
But interestingly, you're now sitting in the United States, and you will be well aware that in the last few months, the Biden administration has made it harder for Nicaraguans who are seeking asylum to enter the United States. Unless you do it online before you make an attempt to get on U.S. soil, you will be immediately expelled when you get onto U.S. territory. Nicaraguans now find that a very difficult situation. Would you be pressing the U.S. government to backtrack, to end that system?
I will continue to work together with my other colleagues of the Nicaraguan opposition, not only to pursue changes inside Nicaragua, but to find the best humanitarian ways with other friendly governments around the region to solve this humanitarian crisis. And yes, we have had conversations at the top level with the U.S. government. In fact, we just landed a few weeks ago, and 5 or 8 hours later, we were having conversations with high officials of the White House and State Department and Congress. And this was at the top of our list, trying to find ways to give a fast track to Nicaraguan refugees.
In a word or two, will you go back to Nicaragua? Do you believe? Do you have faith you will, and be politically active again?
Stephen, yes. As a man of faith, I believe that I will be back in Nicaragua. I don't know if I will go back as a politician. I'm more comfortable in my skin as a human rights activist, as an academic. So I'm not prepared to say that I will be as a politician. But Nicaragua is the country I love, and is the country where I will be someday, soon.
Félix Maradiaga, it's been a pleasure to have you on Hard Talk again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen.